The telegram arrived at 9:30 on the morning of March 14, 1888, and sat unopened on the desk of the Dakota Territory Land Office in Huron for nearly 40 minutes. This detail appears in the deposition given by Clerk Howard Messner 3 weeks later, and it is worth noting not because the delay mattered in any measurable way, but because it establishes a pattern that would repeat itself throughout that day. The assumption that there would be time enough to attend to things properly in their natural order. The telegram was from the Omaha office of the U.S. Signal Service. It warned of a severe weather system moving northeast from the Nebraska Panhandle. Temperature drop expected to be rapid and significant. All parties currently in open country advised to seek immediate shelter. Messner remembered the wording because he'd thought it oddly formal, almost stilted. Immediate had seemed like Signal Service dramatics. The sky that morning had been overcast but calm. No wind to speak of. The kind of grey March day that suggested nothing more troubling than mud and perhaps a cold rain by evening. When he finally opened the telegram, Messner made a note in the logbook, standard procedure, and then walked it down the hall to Thomas Whitlaw, the county surveyor, whose office managed the field crews currently working the township grid west of the James River. Whitlaw was meeting with a banker from Chicago about railway easements. The conversation was going well. Messner set the telegram on the corner of the desk and returned to his own work. It was, by all accounts, a decision made without anxiety. There were 6 survey crews scattered across the open prairie, each consisting of 3 to 5 men. They had tents, bedrolls, coal oil stoves, and several days' worth of provisions. They were professionals. If the weather turned, they knew how to manage. Whitlaw read the telegram at approximately 10:15. He later testified that he considered sending a rider out to the nearest crew, which was camped along Dry Creek some 9 miles west. But the nearest crew was also the most experienced, led by Samuel Dorch, a Union Army veteran who had spent 2 winters surveying the Montana Territory. If anyone could read weather and make a sound decision, it was Dorch. Whitlaw made a note to check back by early afternoon. If conditions worsened, he would dispatch riders then. The decision was reasonable. It reflected confidence in his men and a belief that the prairie, while unforgiving, gave fair warning before it turned deadly. The day's work continued. At 11:30, a handwritten entry appears in the daily log kept by the Western Union office in Huron. Temperature holding steady at 31 degrees, wind light from the south, visibility good. At the same hour, Samuel Dorch's crew was completing the final measurements on a section line that would, once filed, officially establish the boundary between 2 newly platted townships. The work had taken 3 days. 1 more afternoon, and they'd be finished. Dorch's field journal, recovered later and now housed in the South Dakota State Archives, contains a sketch of the survey marker they set that morning, along with a brief note. Clear ground. Fair weather. Should finish Friday and return Saturday. There is no mention of concern, no second guessing. The tone is steady, clerical, confident, and in this perhaps lies the first quiet fracture in what would later be called a tragedy of errors. Not a single person involved believed they were making a dangerous choice. The weather was poor, yes, but not alarming. The crews were equipped and experienced. There was no panic, because there seemed no reason for panic. At noon, the temperature in Huron was 28 degrees. The wind had picked up slightly but remained southerly, a typical early spring pattern. It was noted much later that this was the last moment when every crew could have been recalled with time to spare. Riders sent at noon would have reached even the farthest camps by mid-afternoon, well before dark, well before the cold arrived in earnest. But no riders were sent. The official incident report, filed with the Department of the Interior in May of 1888, includes this line. At no point prior to 1400 hours did conditions suggest an immediate threat to personnel in the field. The word immediate appears again. It is a word that asks to be weighed against outcome. Immediate by whose measure? Immediate compared to what? These are the questions historians ask when the record goes silent. Because by 2 o'clock that afternoon, the wind had shifted to the northwest, The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees, and the first scouts sent to check on the crews found the roads rapidly disappearing beneath blowing snow. And by then, though no one yet understood it, there was no longer time enough for anything. The 6 crews working the survey grid that March had been in the field for 11 days. This was neither unusual nor particularly concerning. Spring surveys in Dakota Territory typically ran 2 to 3 weeks, depending on weather and the complexity of the section lines being measured. The men were paid by the day and worked in rotating teams. Most were locals, farm laborers, out-of-work railroad men, a few former soldiers who had stayed in the territory after their service ended. They understood the prairie. They had grown up with its moods. Samuel Dorch's crew, camped along Dry Creek, consisted of 5 men: Dorch himself, who served as lead surveyor, his assistant, George Farrell, 2 chainmen named Otto Bruckner and James Calloway, and a cook and camp tender named Lyle Pritchard, who was 16 and had been hired primarily because his father owned the general store in Huron and had vouched for his competence. Pritchard's letters home, 3 survive, preserved by his mother and later donated to the County Historical Society, provide a rare glimpse into the mundane rhythm of the camp. In a letter dated March 10th, 4 days before the storm, he writes, "We are fed well, and the work is not hard. Mr. Dorch is fair and does not push us beyond what is reasonable. The nights are cold, but we have good blankets and the stove keeps the tent warm enough. I expect we will be home by the 17th or 18th at the latest." There is no apprehension in the language. The letter reads like a boy writing home from a school trip, mildly bored, mildly proud, impatient to return, but not unhappy with the experience. On the morning of March 14th, Dorch's crew woke at dawn as usual. Pritchard cooked oatmeal and bacon. The men ate, gathered their instruments, and walked the half-mile to the section corner they were measuring. The work was technical but repetitive, stretching the surveyor's chain, recording distances, calculating angles, checking and rechecking to ensure the measurements matched the federal plat. Weather was discussed. Farrell, the assistant surveyor, mentioned that the sky looked heavy, and Otto Bruckner, who had emigrated from Bavaria and claimed to have an instinct for snow, said he thought they'd see flurries by nightfall. Dorch's response is recorded in Farrell's later testimony. "Then we'd better finish today while we can still see the ground." It was practical advice, not a warning. The assumption was that they would complete the section line, pack the camp, and begin the return journey to Huron the following morning. If snow came, it would be a nuisance, not a danger. They had done this work in snow before. What they did not know, what no one in the field could have known, was that the system moving toward them was not a typical spring snowstorm. It was a collision of air masses, warm, wet air from the Gulf pushing north, meeting a brutal cold front sweeping down from Canada. When the 2 systems met, the temperature would not drop gradually. It would collapse. But in the moment, there were no signs of catastrophe. The wind was light. The temperature, while cool, was tolerable. The men worked steadily through the morning, and by noon they were nearly finished. At the Huron Land Office, Thomas Whitlaw was reviewing contracts. He had not forgotten the telegram, but neither had he acted on it. There was a logic to his inaction that made sense within the context of the day. The weather was holding, the crews were experienced, and sending riders out prematurely would have been an expensive overreaction. Riders cost money. If dispatched unnecessarily, it looked like panic. Whitlaw was a careful administrator. He did not want to be the man who cried wolf. This calculus, cost weighed against perceived risk, appears repeatedly in the records. It is not negligence exactly. It is something quieter, a series of small, reasonable decisions that, in aggregate, created a window of vulnerability no one recognized until it had closed. By 1 o'clock, the wind had begun to shift. Dorch's crew noticed it first, not because the change was violent, but because the air suddenly smelled different, colder, sharper. Bruckner said in his deposition that he suggested to Dorch they should pack up immediately and begin the ride back to Huron. Dorch agreed, but decided they should finish the final measurements first. Another hour of work, perhaps 90 minutes at most. Then They would be done properly, and the job wouldn't have to be repeated. It was a surveyor's instinct. Complete the task. Do it right. Don't leave work half-finished. Farrell later said he felt uneasy but couldn't articulate why. It wasn't the snow, he testified. It was the stillness before the snow, like something waiting. But unease is not the same as alarm, and no one argued with Dorch's decision. They worked another hour. At 2 o'clock, the temperature in Huron dropped to 16 degrees. The wind, now out of the northwest, gusted to 20 miles per hour. The sky turned the color of iron. At 2:15, Thomas Whitlaw finally dispatched riders to the survey camps. They were, by his own later admission, 2 hours too late. The storm arrived not as a crescendo, but as a slow constriction of the world. This is the detail that survivors emphasized most often in their testimony. The way the blizzard did not announce itself with thunder or drama, but simply erased the horizon, degree by degree, until there was no distance left to measure. Dorch's crew was still working at 2:30 when the first snow began to fall. It came lightly at first, small dry flakes that swirled rather than fell, caught in eddies of wind that seemed to come from all directions at once. Farrell, the assistant surveyor, looked up from his notebook and said, "We should go now." Dorch nodded. He was kneeling beside the survey marker, making a final notation in his field journal. 5 minutes, he said. It is unclear whether those 5 minutes were taken. The field journal was found later, open to the entry for March 14th, with the pencil still wedged in the binding. The final line reads, "Section corner established per plat. Variance negligible. Recommend." The sentence ends there. What happened next can be reconstructed only partially, based on physical evidence and the testimony of James Calloway, the only member of Dorch's crew who survived. Calloway was 23 years old, a farm laborer from Yankton, who had signed on as a chainman because the pay was better than field work. He was interviewed twice, once in April of 1888, while still recovering at the Huron Hospital, and again in 1891 by a researcher compiling an oral history of the storm. The accounts differ slightly in detail but agree on sequence. According to Calloway, the crew began packing their instruments at approximately 2:35. The snow was falling more heavily by then, and the wind, still not violent but persistent, was beginning to drift the ground cover. Dorch ordered the men to return to camp immediately. The distance was just over half a mile, an easy walk under normal conditions. They had made the trip twice daily for nearly 2 weeks and knew the route by landmarks: a low rise, a dry creek bed, a stand of cottonwoods near the tent. They set out in single file, Dorch leading, Pritchard bringing up the rear with the toolbox. For the first 10 minutes, nothing seemed particularly wrong. The snow was thickening, visibility was dropping, but the ground was still visible beneath their feet. They could see each other. They were moving in the right direction, and then, and this is the moment Calloway returns to again and again in his testimony, the wind shifted a second time. "It didn't get stronger," he said in the 1891 interview. "It got everywhere. You couldn't tell where it was coming from anymore, and the snow wasn't falling down. It was flying horizontal, like being inside a cloud that was tearing itself apart." The technical term is a ground blizzard, a phenomenon in which high winds lift existing snow from the ground and suspend it in the air, creating whiteout conditions even when precipitation is light. The Dakota Territory, with its flat topography and lack of windbreaks, is uniquely vulnerable to this type of storm. Within minutes, the crew lost sight of the landmarks. Dorch stopped and called for the men to close ranks. Calloway remembered hearing his voice, but not being able to see him, even though he couldn't have been more than 10 feet ahead. They tried to continue. Dorch believed they were still moving toward the camp, but the loss of visual reference made it impossible to maintain a straight line. Without realizing it, they began to drift south, away from the creek, and into open prairie. How long they walked is unclear. Calloway estimated 30 minutes, though he acknowledged that time became difficult to judge. At some point, Bruckner, the chainman from Bavaria, shouted that they should stop and wait for the storm to pass. Dorch refused. His reasoning, as Calloway recalled it, was that stopping in open ground would be fatal. If they kept moving, they might stumble onto a landmark, a fence line, a homestead, anything that would give them shelter or orientation. It was not an unreasonable decision. Men caught in blizzards have survived by walking through them. Others have died 50 feet from safety because they stopped moving and froze in place. Dorch was making a calculated choice based on incomplete information, which is all anyone in his position could have done. But the calculation was already wrong. The camp was now behind them, not ahead, and with every step they moved farther from safety. At some point, again the timeline is vague, Dorch ordered the men to tie themselves together using the surveyor's chain. This is confirmed by the physical evidence. When the bodies were found, Dorch, Farrell, Bruckner and Pritchard were still connected by a 75-foot length of chain looped through their belts. Calloway was not attached. He later said he'd been at the rear of the line and either the chain ran out or he was somehow separated before the attachment was made. He doesn't remember clearly. What he does remember is the cold. It wasn't like winter cold, he said. Winter you can bundle against. This was something different. It went through your coat like you weren't wearing one, and it got inside you, your chest, your bones, and you started shaking so hard you couldn't hold on to anything. The temperature, according to later meteorological analysis, likely dropped to somewhere between 10 and 20 degrees below zero within 90 minutes of the storm's onset. With wind chill factored in, the effective temperature would have been significantly lower, perhaps as low as 40 or 50 below. At that temperature, frostbite begins in minutes. Hypothermia follows soon after. Calloway said he fell at some point and couldn't get up. He lay in the snow, certain he was going to die, and then, for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself standing again, walking. He had no sense of direction. He was simply moving because stopping meant freezing. He did not see the other men again. The storm continued through the night and into the following morning. By the time it cleared on the afternoon of March 15th, more than 2 feet of snow had fallen in some areas, and drifts as high as 10 feet blocked roads and rail lines across the southern Dakota Territory. Calloway was found shortly after dawn on March 16th by a homesteader named Ernst Mueller, who was checking his livestock. Calloway had collapsed in a shallow ravine less than 3 miles from the original survey camp. He was unconscious, severely frostbitten, and suffering from exposure. Mueller loaded him into a wagon and drove him to Huron. Calloway lost 6 toes and parts of 3 fingers, but he survived. The other 4 men did not. The search began on the morning of March 15th, as soon as the wind dropped enough to permit travel. Thomas Whitlaw organized the first search party, a group of 12 volunteers on horseback, equipped with shovels and blankets. They rode west from Huron at first light, following the route the survey crews would have taken. The snow was still falling lightly, and visibility remained poor. The riders found the survey camp along Dry Creek intact, tent still standing, stove cold, instruments and provisions undisturbed. No sign of the men. Whitlaw later testified that this discovery, an empty camp with no evidence of panic or hurried departure, gave him hope. It suggested the crew had left in an orderly fashion, which implied they'd had a plan. If they'd had a plan, they might have reached shelter. A second search party, organized by the Huron mayor's office, departed the same morning and headed toward the other 5 survey camps scattered across the grid. Of those camps, 3 were found occupied, the crews safe, having waited out the storm in their tents. 1 crew had abandoned their camp early on the 14th and made it back to a homestead 4 miles south. The 5th crew, 3 men working a section line near the town of Iroquois, had also survived, though 1 man had severe frostbite and later required amputation of his left hand. Only Dorch's crew remained unaccounted for. The search continued for 3 days. Riders covered hundreds of square miles, checking every homestead, dugout, and outbuilding within a 15-mile radius of Dry Creek. They found nothing. On March 18th, Ernst Mueller brought James Calloway into Huron. Calloway was delirious and unable to provide coherent directions, but he repeated fragments of information. Walking south, the chain, the cold. Whitlaw used this to narrow the search area, focusing on the open prairie southwest of the survey camp. The bodies were found on March 20th, 6 days after the storm. They were located in a shallow depression approximately 4 miles south of Dry Creek, well off the direct route between the survey marker and the camp. The 4 men were still connected by the surveyor's chain. Dortch was at the front, kneeling as if he had stopped to rest. Farrell and Bruckner were behind him, lying on their sides. Pritchard, the youngest, was at the rear, curled in a fetal position. The recovery team's report, filed with the Dakota Territory Marshal's Office, is clinically brief. Bodies recovered intact. No evidence of trauma or violence. Cause of death presumed exposure. Personal effects inventoried and returned to next of kin. Site marked for county records. There is no mention of what the men's faces looked like, or whether their eyes were open, or any of the small human details that might give weight to the scene. The report is professional, impersonal, efficient, but 2 details are noted, almost as afterthoughts. First, the toolbox was found beside Dortch's body. He had carried it the entire way. Second, Pritchard's coat pockets contained a folded letter, addressed to his mother, but never sent. The letter was dated March 13th, the day before the storm, and ended with the line, "I will be home by Saturday. Save me some of your apple cake." An inquest was held in Huron on March 28th. Testimony was taken from Whitlaw, Messner, Calloway, and several others involved in the decision-making process leading up to the storm. The proceedings lasted 2 days. The inquest's conclusion, as recorded in the official summary, reads, "The deaths of Samuel Dortch, George Farrell, Otto Bruckner, and Lyle Pritchard occurred as a result of exposure during the severe weather event of March 14-15, 1888. No evidence of negligence or misconduct was found. The decision to maintain survey operations on the morning of March 14th was consistent with standard practice and reasonable given available information. Recommendation: future weather warnings from the U.S. Signal Service should be treated with greater urgency, particularly when field personnel are operating in unsheltered areas. The language is careful. It assigns no blame. It acknowledges that mistakes were made, but frames them as systemic rather than individual. No one is held responsible because no single decision can be isolated as the cause. This is, perhaps, the most quietly disturbing aspect of the official record, the refusal to name a villain. Because if no one was negligent, then the tragedy becomes simply a matter of bad luck. A confluence of poor weather, poor timing, and poor judgment that could not have been predicted or prevented. And yet, reading through the depositions, one finds a persistent undertone of regret. Messner, the telegraph clerk, testified that he should have walked the telegram directly to Whitlaw's office and insisted it be read immediately. "But I didn't want to interrupt a meeting over what seemed like routine weather," he said. "That was my mistake." Whitlaw testified that he should have sent riders at 10:30 when he first read the telegram. "If I had acted then," he said, "the men would have been back in Huron by early afternoon. They would be alive." Even Calloway, the survivor, carried guilt. In his 1891 interview, he was asked whether Dortch made the right decision in continuing to walk rather than stopping to wait out the storm. Calloway's response: "I don't know. I don't think anyone can know, but I think about it every day." The families of the dead men filed no lawsuits. There were no public recriminations, no demands for accountability. The funerals were held quietly, and the men were buried in the Huron cemetery in graves marked with simple stones. Lyle Pritchard's headstone reads, "Beloved son, taken too soon." It is the only grave that includes an epitaph. The blizzard of March 14-15, 1888, later known as the Schoolhouse Blizzard, due to the number of children who died after being caught between home and school, killed an estimated 235 people across the Dakota Territory, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Montana. Samuel Dortch, George Farrell, Otto Bruckner, and Lyle Pritchard represent a small fraction of that total. Their deaths were not unique. Dozens of similar stories played out across the prairie that day. Farmers caught between barn and house, travelers stranded on roads, children lost in fields within sight of home. What distinguishes the Dorch crew in the historical record is not the tragedy itself, but the clarity with which the tragedy's anatomy can be traced. Because of the telegram, the depositions, the field journal, and Calloway's testimony, we have an almost minute-by-minute account of how the disaster unfolded, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow accumulation of small delays, reasonable assumptions, and missed opportunities. It is tempting to search for a turning point, the moment when disaster became inevitable. But the records resist this. There is no single decision that, if reversed, would have saved the men. Instead, there are dozens of small moments, any one of which might have altered the outcome. If Messner had delivered the telegram immediately, if Whitlaw had dispatched riders at 10 instead of 2, if Dorch had stopped work at noon instead of continuing through the early afternoon, if the crew had turned back the moment the snow began, if they had stopped walking and huddled together instead of pressing forward into the storm, each of these decisions was defensible in the moment. None was obviously reckless. Taken individually, they reflect ordinary caution, ordinary confidence, ordinary human judgment operating under uncertainty. But cumulatively, they created a margin so thin that when the weather turned, there was no space left for error. The historian encounters this pattern repeatedly when studying disasters. The way catastrophe is rarely the result of a single dramatic failure, but rather the convergence of many small plausible failures that compound until the system collapses. And by the time the collapse is recognized, the moment for intervention has already passed. What haunts the record of March 14, 1888, is not the violence of the storm, though the storm was violent, but the quietness of the decisions that preceded it. Men sitting in warm offices, reading telegrams and deciding they could wait. Men working in open fields, noticing the wind shift and deciding they could finish the job first. Men walking through snow, disoriented and cold, deciding they could keep moving just a little farther. None of them knew they were making fatal choices. None of them felt the ground disappearing beneath them until it was gone. James Calloway lived until 1934. He never returned to survey work. For the rest of his life, he worked as a clerk in his father-in-law's hardware store in Yankton, a job that kept him indoors, away from open country. In his final interview, conducted in 1932 by a WPA oral history project, Calloway was asked whether he still thought about the storm. "Every winter," he said. "Every time it snows, I think about how close we came, and how we didn't know." The interviewer asked what he meant by close. Calloway thought for a moment. "We were half a mile from camp when the snow started. Half a mile. If we'd left 10 minutes earlier, we'd have made it. But we didn't leave 10 minutes earlier. We left when we left. And that was the difference between living and dying. 10 minutes we didn't even know we'd lost." This, perhaps, is the core lesson the historical record offers, that time is not neutral. It does not wait to be used wisely. It passes at the same rate whether we recognize its value or not. And the difference between safety and catastrophe is often nothing more than the gap between soon and now. The telegram warning of the storm was received at 9:30 in the morning. The storm reached Huron at 2:15 in the afternoon. In the span of those 4 hours and 45 minutes, there were perhaps a dozen moments when action could have been taken, messages sent, men recalled. But at no point did anyone feel they were running out of time. And so they didn't run. They walked. They deliberated. They finished their work properly. They made reasonable choices. And by the time they understood that reasonable was not enough, the storm had already come, the visibility was gone, and the world had contracted to the small circle of white noise and cold within which 4 men tried and failed to find their way home. The surveyor's chain that connected them was found intact, 75 feet of forged iron links that had held firm through the storm. It is now part of the collection at the South Dakota State Historical Society, displayed in a glass case alongside Dorch's field journal and a photograph of the 4 men, taken in Huron on March 3, 1888, 11 days before they died. In the photograph, they are standing in front of the land office, instruments at their feet, squinting slightly in the sunlight. They look competent, confident, prepared. They looked like men who believed they had time,